Congratulations, Captain. Your interest in this tape demonstrates your desire to properly maintain your boat and protect your investment. It also indicates that you want your boat to run smoothly and to be safe for you and your guests. Good maintenance begins by forming good habits the first time you use your boat. As you follow these procedures, you will learn to always be on the lookout for small developing problems, which if left unattended, could become costly to repair. In order to best demonstrate these maintenance procedures, a variety of power and sailboats has been selected. Subjects covered in this tape include pre-use checkout, maintenance of hull, decks, mast and fittings, haul-out, engines and safety gear. Now let's begin by checking the systems. These procedures are preventive maintenance and should be followed to make sure everything works before you take your boat out. First, check the electrical panel. Test both sets of batteries. Turn on the main switch to both batteries, then all the switches needed for today's cruise. Cabin lights, engine compartment lights and blower, navigation instruments, bilge pump, water pump and accessories. If the engine compartment lights or bilge blower are on separate systems, turn them on as well. It's a good idea to check the running lights in case you return after dark. If the lights aren't working, check the bulbs and connections. Check the back of the electrical panel now and then for corrosion or overheated circuits. Next, inspect the bilge for water. Notice we have a battery-operated bilge pump with an automatic float switch. There is a little bit of water in the bilge, which is normal. Activate the automatic float switch, which turns on the pump. Also test the bilge alarm if there is one. If your bilge pump doesn't have an automatic float switch, turn on the manual switch and test the pump. If the pump doesn't work, check the fuse and connections. Then look to see if there are any restrictions in the pump or hose. It's a good idea to add a little bilge cleaner from time to time. Also operate the manual bilge pump before going to sea. Next, check the valves in the head. Notice that the valves are in the closed position. That is, the handle is across the valve. Open the valves. Head intake and discharge. Operate the head. Next, open the valves for the sink drains in the head and galley. While there, check the hoses and fittings for any new leaks. Open up the engine access hatch to check for fumes. If the boat has a gasoline engine, the boat should have a gas vapor detector system. If not, put your nose as close to the bilge area as possible to sniff for gasoline fumes. If no gasoline fumes are detected in the engine compartment, activate the bilge blower for a minimum of 4 or 5 minutes before starting the engine. If fumes are detected, do not under any circumstances attempt to start the engine or activate any electrical equipment until you've made a complete inspection of the engine and fuel system to determine if there is an active gasoline leak. If gas fumes are present and you cannot find a fuel leak, activate the engine compartment extractor blower to expel the fumes. If the smell of fumes persist, do not start the engine. It is definitely time to get professional help from a marine mechanic to find out if there is a safety hazard. The bilge blower procedure is not necessary for a diesel engine. Now, open the seacock or gate valve for the engine raw water cooling system. It's a good idea to leave the ignition keys attached to the valve handle to remind you to turn on the valve. Make a quick look around the engine components, such as fuel lines, belts, and hoses to make sure everything is ship-shape. Also check the propeller shaft packing glands and rudder gland for leaks. Make a visual inspection of the sea strainer, if it's the transparent type. If it's not, open it up from time to time to inspect for foreign matter and clear if necessary. Open the fuel valves and inspect them for leaks. Check fuel level, either by gauge or dipstick. Check the oil dipstick level, making sure the oil is up to the full line. And if the engine has a fresh water heat exchanger, check its water level as well. This will ensure the engine won't overheat. Now start the engine or engines. Once the engine is running, check the oil pressure and the amp meter. At this point, look over the stern to ensure that water is coming out of the exhaust. Let the engine run for at least 5 minutes before getting underway. Then, check the temperature gauge to be sure it's in the correct range. After making sure the engine is running smoothly, it's time to check the steering. Turn the wheel over from lock to lock. There seems to be no apparent restriction in the steering mechanism. Turn on the depth sounder to ensure it's reading correctly. Then turn on the radio to be sure you are receiving. A properly working radio will come in handy in case of an emergency. Check in the stern compartment. A visual inspection for any items such as a mop, brush handles, or other gear which could foul the steering cables. Finally, with the engine at idle speed, put the gear lever into forward and observe if the gearbox fully engages. Next, try reverse for a moment. This is to ensure that you have full control of the gear mechanism and there are no defects in the cables or linkage. Is the propeller wash evident astern? Remember to check the gauge on the fire extinguisher. Is it reading in the correct range? Walk around the deck and make a quick check to be sure everything is secure. This goes for below decks as well. One last procedure before you cast off. Show the crew where the life jackets, fire extinguishers, throwable life ring, and horn are located. Now you are ready for a safe and pleasant cruise. Did anyone remember to bring the ice? You have enjoyed a great day of boating, hopefully with no gear failure or problems. Just a little too much sun, but with good sunblock, there should be no sunburn. Now it's time to begin the second phase of your preventive maintenance procedure. If you've been boating in saltwater, find a freshwater supply and wash down the deck and topsides to get rid of the harmful salt crystals. If you are in freshwater, it's only necessary to wash down when the hull, decks, and superstructure get dirty. Put the recommended amount of boat cleaning liquid into a bucket of water and froth it up. If you have wax on the hull, do not use a detergent, as it will leave streaks on the topside. Use the mop or brush to thoroughly desalt the boat. On sailboats, spray off the sails and rigging to remove the salt. If your decks are teak, use a soft brush. Stroke across the grain from side to side. This will prevent the bristles opening up the grain of the teak and starting ridges and grooves. Brushing athwartships will definitely prolong the life of the teak. Now rinse off the soap. Both salt and freshwater boaters should give the decks a good soaking. This will swell up teak, closing the deck seams. Teak and other wood decks should be wetted often so the seams won't shrink and open up. If this happens, the seams will have to be refilled. Chamois the varnish with a mixture of water and vinegar to give a nice shine to the brightwork. Now a quick wipe of the stainless steel and windows. Yes, you do windows. While you're cleaning topsides, have the crew or guests tidy up below. And finally, reverse the opening up procedures by closing all the valves except the cockpit drains. Make sure the head is well flushed and the valves are closed. You should lubricate the head pump shaft with waterproof grease occasionally and have the correct repair kit on board if the head needs an overhaul. Use a biodegradable toilet tissue and add a deodorant to the holding tank to combat any unpleasant odors. Next, shut off the fuel tank valve. A simple way to remember if a fuel gate valve is open or closed is righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Now, take a quick check to see if any oil, fuel, or water leaks have mysteriously started. It's a good idea to give the engine a quick wipe down before closing the engine compartment. Don't forget to make a final bilge and bilge pump check before shutting down all the circuits and the master battery switch. The automatic bilge pump should always be operative when the master switch is off. Back on deck, put on the covers and make sure the dorade vents are facing the wind. On sailboats, tie off the halyards to prevent them from slapping on the mast in a strong wind. Always check your mooring lines to make sure they're not chafing in the fairleads. It's best to use a plastic hose or leather to prevent chafe. Close and lock the hatch. It's a good idea to use a combination lock so you don't have to wonder where you put the key. At last, captain and crew can leave the vessel and head for the ice cream parlor. Unfortunately, the Gelcoat, which is the shiny finish on the fiberglass, is not impervious to the elements. It's vulnerable to the sun's harmful ultraviolet rays and hydrocarbons from car exhaust. Above the waterline, the hull topsides and fenders pick up oil. After they rub together for a few weeks, the Gelcoat can develop a permanent stain. It's important that you protect the Gelcoat and keep it shining. First, gather together your supplies. Washing solution, stain cleaner, clean rags, 600 grit sandpaper if needed, polish, and a buffer. To begin, give the hull a thorough washing down to remove the grit. Put the recommended amount of boat cleaning liquid into a bucket of water and froth it up with the water hose. Don't use detergent, as it will streak the hull topsides. Wash off and let the surfaces dry. If the hull has some light stains, you can probably remove them with kerosene, alcohol, acetone, or mineral spirits. To remove heavy oxidation, scratches, or discoloration, use a liquid rubbing compound. This abrasive substance will usually restore the original color and shine to the Gelcoat. Rub a small area at a time, then wipe off the residue with a clean, dry cloth. If this method is unsuccessful, the last resort is to use a 600 grit wet and dry sandpaper. Use light circular strokes with the wet sandpaper. Gradually, a little slurry will appear. Clean off the slurry to see if the stain has been lifted. Next, polish the area to get rid of any abrasion. Now, apply a marine polish to these freshly cleaned areas. The hull topsides can be done at the dock or from the dinghy. Put some polish on a clean, soft rag and apply it to the hull using circular strokes. Allow the polish to dry, and then buff it off with a soft rag or sheepskin disc attached to a slow-speed electric buffer. Apply light pressure so you don't remove the polish, leaving a shine but no protection. The surface should then be dusted off to remove any residue clinging to the hull. Do not polish a fiberglass deck, as the surface will be far too slippery, especially when wet. All that's required is a good wash down with a suitable boat cleaner and water to keep the decks in satisfactory condition. Scratches on the plexiglass or Lexan port lights or windows can be improved or removed with a special plexiglass compound scratch remover. Here again, it will take elbow grease and a soft rag to do a good job. Finish off the polish and waxing chores on the remainder of the gel coat, the cabin sides, cockpit seats, and backs. Finally, wipe down all the stainless steel and metal deck fittings with a silicone-based polish and your boat will look like new. If there are deep scratches, cuts, dings, or gouges in the gel coat, cosmetic repairs will be necessary. Sorry, but this is best taken care of by a boat yard or a professional independent fiberglass specialist. Again, as with brightwork, if the boat is kept covered in a boathouse or under full covers, you should only need to wax once a year. Eventually, teak decks will start to look dirty and gray. To bring the decks back to their original color, you can clean them with a solution of powdered oxalic acid and water, or if you prefer, a 2-part teak deck cleaner. Gather all the materials needed for this job: rubber gloves, oxalic acid, or a 2-part deck cleaner, a scrub brush, water hose, and nozzle. First, soak the decks with fresh water, which will swell and open up the grain of the planks. Next, if you are using oxalic acid, pour the crystals into a bucket and add water. After you put on your protective gloves, dip the brush into the bucket and scrub the deck. This is the only time the deck should be scrubbed with the grain. You will see the dirt vanish as if by magic, and the white to light brown color coming back. Keep the decks wet at all times as you brush out the dirt which is ground into the grain of the wood. Rinse the deck, adjoining areas, and hull topsides thoroughly as you go along and again when finished. Also, brush as you rinse. If you choose the 2-part deck cleaner, follow the manufacturer's instructions carefully and remember, thorough rinsing is required when chemicals are applied to teak and synthetic seam filler to prevent deterioration of the seam filler. A word of caution: belt or disc sanding the deck is to be avoided at all costs, as it removes a small amount of the teak deck. After 2 sanding sessions, the thickness of the deck will be reduced to the screw fastenings. If this happens, the fastenings will have to be removed and reset deeper to allow new wood plugs to be glued in. This is a very expensive job. Some prefer to leave their decks natural. Others like to oil their clean decks. If you prefer the oiled look, put some teak oil in a bucket, then apply it evenly to the deck. A thin coat of teak oil on the deck will maintain the teak's natural color and weatherproof it as well. If you find some seams in which the rubber seam filler has detached from the teak, the seams may have to be reefed out and refilled. This is also a very expensive job, and it is so easy to avoid if the proper deck maintenance is practiced. Remember, always keep the decks moist, preferably with salt water, because it's a natural anti-fungicide. Once or twice a year, it's wise to lay another coat of varnish on the brightwork. If the brightwork is covered, then varnishing once a year is acceptable. Before you start, get all of your supplies together. You'll need 220 to 280 grit sandpaper, tack rag, a clean rag, solvent, low tactile masking tape, varnish, varnish thinner, and a good badger brush which has been broken in, or a plastic sponge, either is suitable. Pick a dry, sunny day with no wind or rain. It's always a good idea to lay masking tape on the surfaces adjacent to all wood being varnished to prevent the sandpaper touching it and to catch any overlap with the brush. Start the light sanding with 220 grit paper. Make sure your sanding is very thorough and all the corners and edges are done. Wipe the sanded areas with a clean rag, followed by a tack rag, to absorb any dust or grit on the surface. Finally, wipe the area with solvent on a clean rag. Stir the varnish in the can. Never shake it, as it will form bubbles. Put a small amount of varnish in a clean paint pot and add a little thinner, which the varnish manufacturer recommends. Then, stir it slowly to get an even solution. It's always better to lay on 2 thin coats rather than 1 thick one, which will invariably crinkle and will require heavy resanding to smooth the varnish again. Start varnishing at an edge, putting a small amount of varnish on the tip of your brush. Lay it on the surface in a smooth, even coat. Repeat the process, but this time, gently stroke the brush back towards the starting position. About 2 feather touches should smooth the varnish and lay off the edge so you don't see where the last brush stroke started. Work your way to the end of the piece. Then, move on to the next one. Remember always to lay back on the finishing stroke. When finished, peel off the masking tape at right angles. If you delay the second coat until the next day, remove the masking tape now. If left to the next day, it will be very difficult to remove. To minimize the number of applications of varnish, the varnish must be covered for protection. One simple way is to make your own covers on a sewing machine at home, or have them made by a professional. The cover should be designed to allow a full flow of fresh air under it, as well as adequate vents at the top to allow hot air to vent out. Many boats have developed serious fungus and rot because the covers kept the hot, moist air in and the fresh air out. Another method to prevent sun damage to brightwork is to keep the vessel moored in a covered boathouse. If the varnish is chipped and peeling, it's time to strip it off using a sharp scraper. Make sure you take off the varnish only when you pull the scraper. The blade should be sharpened with the file whenever it gets dull. Extreme care is required using a scraper so that adjacent surfaces are not damaged. When all the varnish is stripped off, sand the wood to a smooth finish. Use a fine-grained sandpaper to get the best results. Then brush or vacuum all the dust to ensure none will get in the varnish. Wipe with a clean rag. Then with a tack rag. Mask the adjoining area so the varnish doesn't seep under the tape and run onto the molding below. Next, apply 1 or 2 coats of a 50-50 mixture of varnish and thinner. These coats will soak into the grain of the wood and seal it. It's best to start building up the coats of varnish, with a minimum of 5 to 8 coats being necessary to give good protection to the wood. Thorough sanding is required between coats. If all the wood, such as cap rails, handrails, cockpit seat, and back, is teak, and you choose to have the natural look, you can clean it with a mixture of powdered oxalic acid and water. Or, if you prefer the oiled surface, let it dry thoroughly and apply a coat or 2 of teak oil. These procedures will save a lot of maintenance time. Some fiberglass boats have wood superstructures and trim. If the wood on your boat isn't protected with varnish or oil, it's probably protected by paint. From time to time, these surfaces need to be repainted. First, gather together all the supplies needed for the job. Scraper and sharpening file, 150 to 180 grit sandpaper, low-tack masking tape, clean rag, tack rag, undercoat paint and thinner, gloss paint, a good badger hair paintbrush. First, mask the adjoining edges to protect them from over-sanding and paint runs. Press the tape hard on the surface to prevent paint seeping under the tape. Remove any fittings so you can sand and paint under them. Select the proper grit sandpaper for the job. The lower the number on the paper, the coarser the grit. Sand the area carefully, making sure all the corners and edges are sanded. Wipe off with a clean rag. And then a tack rag. Now it's time to paint the undercoat. Shake the paint can to make sure the paint is well mixed. Then pour some paint into a paint pot. Pour only enough to do the job and recap the can. Add in the correct amount of thinner recommended by the manufacturer and stir well. Clean the brush with a clean rag. Dip the brush into the paint and squeeze off the excess. Start the first stroke at a suitable edge and brush away. The finishing strokes should be brushed back into the area just covered. Do not brush from the covered area. Lay on a thin coat. A second coat can be applied as soon as the first coat dries. When this second coat dries, the surface should be lightly sanded, fair and smooth. Wipe off as before and apply a thinned coat of gloss enamel. It will take 2 coats to give a good, smooth, protective covering. Finally, peel off the masking tape at right angles. If you delay painting the gloss coats until the next day, peel off the masking tape and retape it the next day. This should prevent the tape from sticking and peeling off the paint or varnish from the adjoining surfaces. And clean the brush thoroughly, first with paint thinner, then detergent. A well-cleaned brush can be used for years. Today, The majority of sailboats have aluminum alloy masts and booms, which are either anodized or painted. Some of the older boats have wooden masts, usually made of Sitka spruce in a hollow section. These are painted or varnished. Aluminum masts and booms are usually painted with a 2-part linear polyurethane paint, a very durable finish which should last for many years. However, you may find some blistered paint, often in the area of winches, fittings, and mast track. If the blisters are few and small and can be reached from the deck, they can be treated without removing the mast. However, if the blisters are extensive, it's best to remove the mast so that all the fittings, track, and winches can be removed. This is the only way to do a thorough job. The products you need are rubber gloves, goggles and face mask, scraper, wire brush or grinder, sandpaper, acid wash, acid etching epoxy, epoxy metal primer, clean rags, sponge, tack rag, a sponge or good bristle brush, or spray gun, and finally, the 2-part linear polyurethane paint. After you have removed all the fittings, winches, and track, begin by scraping away all the loose paint and oxidation with a scraper. Then, sand smooth the rough edges to properly prepare the aluminum for the next step. Another method is to grind off all the loose paint and oxidation with an air grinder or an orbital sander. Following the manufacturer's instructions, mix a solution of water and an etching acid which is suitable for decorroding aluminum. Using a small throwaway brush, coat all the areas that have been prepared. This will remove the corrosion. The acid will react with the aluminum, forming bubbles. When the acid has finished its action, wash it off before it dries, making sure to wash inside the mast and any other areas where the acid might have leaked. When these areas are dry, coat the surface with a chemical conversion coating, which enters into the pores of the aluminum and seals them. Do not let this dry either. Again, wash off thoroughly. While waiting for the surface to dry, mix the 2 parts of the epoxy primer paint together. Apply 1 coat and let it dry. Sand to smooth the rough edges. Then, sand the complete mass to prepare for the final coat, which can be brushed on with a good bristle brush. Another method of applying the undercoat is by spraying in a dust-free shed. The undercoat will be followed with a final coat of linear polyurethane paint. If you don't have the use of a shed, you can spray outside using a spray gun. But make sure the overspray does not hit other boats or cars nearby. Spray equipment can be rented in most areas. Finally, when the last coat of linear polyurethane is set, the fittings can be installed. They should be insulated from the mast with neoprene or PVC. The screws and fastenings should be smeared with zinc chromate paste to insulate them and to prevent galvanic corrosion and blisters reoccurring between the fittings and mast. Lubricate the halyard sheave through boats with a non-water soluble grease. This will ensure that the sheaves will turn and the halyards will run freely. Nothing is worse than having a halyard jam when you need to get your sail down in a hurry. Insert the through bolts into the sheaves and bend the cotter pins over to ensure they won't fall out. The painted or varnished masts can be done in two ways. One is to remove the mast from the boat and have it laid on supports. This is the most ideal way to inspect, repair, and paint the mast and booms, as they are easier to work on. Most boatyards have hoisting equipment for removing masts. You can also remove all of the standing and running rigging and fittings to inspect for cracks or defects. Any defective components can be easily replaced at this time. Now, the mast, rigging, and fittings should be examined very carefully with a magnifying glass once a season to be absolutely certain there are no impending failures. High stress loads on spreaders, base of the mast, and fittings could cause cracks and breaks to develop, resulting in an expensive dismasting. Wooden mast can decay and rot, particularly at the mast step. If you have to adjust the rigging often, perhaps your mast base is rotten. The other method of servicing a mast is to go aloft in a bosun's chair. This method will require a trusty helper who can hoist and lower you in the chair. If you can't get a helper, you can work alone by rigging a block and tackle which is hoisted to the masthead on the main or jib halyard. You then hoist and lower yourself with little difficulty as you work on the mast. It should be understood that it requires some bosun's chair gymnastics to properly prepare and paint a mast. But if the sanding is done carefully, a satisfactory paint or varnish job can be done aloft. Great view from the top there, too. Should you have to replace any fittings, such as the spreader or halyard sheaves, it will be difficult to do in a chair. Jobs like these should be left to the professional riggers. A swedge is the stainless steel end fitting, permanently attached to the standing rigging. A cracked swedge can often be detected and replaced before it fails, particularly the lower swedges, which usually fail before the uppers. It's essential to keep the rig in one piece in the boat. Many dismastings could have been prevented if more inspections had been made. Check the standing rigging for strands which have parted. The sails, running rigging, and sheets should be given a careful examination at the end of the sailing season. Mark any areas on the sails that require restitching with masking tape. Take the sails to the sailmaker early so your sails will be ready for the spring sailing season. Don't wait until the week before your first race or cruise. Your sailmaker will advise you when your sails should be replaced, usually when they become brittle and have been restitched several times. The thing to remember regarding sails and any other equipment on board is, when in doubt, throw it out. The mooring lines should also be inspected for chafe and replaced if they are stranded. One good way to find out who your real friends are is to ask them if they'll give you a hand when you haul your boat out. You'll probably find they are conveniently busy elsewhere that weekend. So, with or without your friends, the vessel will have to be hauled out every 18 months or so to do the underbody maintenance, as well as to check all the operating systems. In every boating area, there should be at least one boatyard that will take your boat out of the water. If there are more than one, compare the prices and time schedules. Also, find out if you can work on your own boat. One method of hauling is a cradle on an elevator lift. This is one of the earliest ways of getting a boat into dry dock. The most common method is the travel lift. But many of the bigger yards have marine railways. You can start your interior maintenance while waiting to be hauled out. Examine the rudder shaft and propeller shaft packing glands for leaks. A serious leak can cause a boat to sink at the dock, which certainly puts a damper on your weekend. If the propeller shaft gland is leaking, the packing gland nut will have to be tightened. First, loosen the keeper nut. Then, tighten the gland nut until the leak stops. Now tighten the keeper nut. If tightening the gland nut does not stop the leak, the gland washers will have to be replaced. As soon as the boat is out of the water, the hull underbody should be pressure cleaned with fresh water to remove the marine growth which is adhered to the paint. This will not remove the barnacles. When the boat is high and dry, there are several components that will require servicing. First, the seacocks and hull valves should be disassembled, cleaned up, and inspected for galvanic corrosion, commonly known as electrolysis, which will be evident by a pink color to the bronze. If this condition exists, the fittings are defective and should be replaced. The cause of the galvanic corrosion will have to be determined by a marine surveyor or a full electrical inspection so the defect can be corrected. Sand all the inner surfaces of the seacock with wet and dry sandpaper. If the seacocks are a clear bronze color, they can be reassembled. Lubricate them with a good non-water soluble grease. They should be reassembled tight enough so closing and opening them can be done with one hand. They shouldn't be so loose that they leak when the boat is launched. Some valves are the common household gate valve type, which fails because the threaded stem inside the valve corrodes away, leaving the valve inoperative. The stem usually breaks off when the valve is being closed or opened. If the valve for the raw water engine cooling system breaks in the closed position, there will be no cooling water for the engine. If the components of the gate valve are a clear bronze color, they can be reassembled. Lubricate the components with a non-water soluble grease. They should be put together tight enough so there are no leaks when the boat is launched. When the valves fail, they should always be replaced with an approved bronze or plastic seacock or a Manel ball valve. These are very reliable if serviced and exercised from time to time. Remember, an unused valve can seize up. The seacock or gate valve should be screwed onto the through hull using a nylon tape or mastic on the threads to ensure a tight waterproof fit. It's a good idea to check out all of the hoses which have been removed from the seacocks to see if they're brittle, cracked, and need replacing. Also, any rusty hose clamps should be replaced now. Install double hose clamps on all connections. It's important to make sure there is a metal or plastic pipe fitting under the clamps, because without protection, a clamp can cut into the hose and cause a leak. To prevent rusty hose clamps, smear them with a non-water soluble jelly. All valves in the vessel's hull should be serviced, including the engine, sink drains, and cockpit drains. In the possible event of a hose and/or valve failure, a fitted tapered wooden plug can be attached to each through hull with a short lanyard or wire. It will always be ready for immediate use. There may also be some corrosion on the propeller. Tap the propeller very gently with a hammer. It should give a good, clear, ringing sound, like a bell. If it gives off a dull thud, it will have to be replaced because the zinc has been released from the bronze by galvanic corrosion. If a galvanic corrosion condition is evident, it's probably due to complete deterioration of a sacrificial zinc anodes, especially if they haven't been replaced for a year. In some harbors, the zincs have wasted away in 6 months or less. Naturally, you don't want to have the expense or inconvenience of hauling your boat out every 6 months. So hire a diver to go under and replace the anodes and clean off any excess marine growth while he's down there. If the propeller appears sound, and there are no dents in the blades, the next test is to see if the propeller is running true. Hold a stick or ruler against the rudder. Then place the end of the stick so that it just touches the tip of one propeller blade. Slowly rotate the propeller so the next blade tip is in line with the stick. Do this with all the blades. If they're all in line with the stick, the propeller is running true. If one or more blades is off by 1/8 of an inch or more, the propeller should be serviced for pitching and balancing. To prevent barnacles from adhering to the propeller, sand the blades. Then heat the propeller with a propane torch to open up the pores of the bronze. Then coat the blades with Teflon spray or an anti-friction engine oil additive. Next, the propeller shaft cutlass rubber bearing should be checked to ensure there's a minimum of movement between the shaft and bearing. This worn bearing should be replaced by the yard personnel. This badly worn bearing has been replaced. The rudder shaft bushing should be tested for wear. Attempt to move the rudder in any direction. If there's noticeable movement between the rudder bushing and shaft, the rudder bushing will have to be replaced or shimmed by the yard personnel. Some rudders are connected to the aft end of the keel by marine hinges called pintles and gudgeons. They may show signs of wear after many years. This will require the removal of the rudder so the gudgeons can be rebushed or the pintles built up. Another job for the yard personnel. This is now a good opportunity to inspect the complete steering system inside the hull. Check that the linkage and adjustments are correct and sound. Make sure they are secured by cotter pins or lock nuts. Check all the cables to make sure they are not frayed or stranded. Give the cable a good application of grease. If your cables are slack like these, the tension should be adjusted. Check that the turning blocks are securely attached and the sheaves and pins are lubricated and turn freely. Make sure the cotter pins are in good condition. Then turn the wheel to make sure it moves freely without any restriction in the mechanism. Inspect the rudder shaft packing gland for leaks. This can be adjusted the same way as the propeller shaft packing gland, which was shown earlier on this tape. Finally, try out the emergency steering tiller to ensure you know how to fit it. If a steering cable or fitting breaks, wheel steering will not be possible. Lash this tiller in a cockpit locker so you can get it in a hurry if the cable or a link breaks. Make sure no loose gear such as fenders, lines, mops, or brushes can foul the steering system. Get into the habit of inspecting the steering system 2 to 3 times a season, just to make sure it's in good condition. As with Murphy's Law, malfunctioning steering always occurs at the worst time, like in heavy weather when the vessel is on a lee shore. Unfortunately, many fiberglass hulls develop a mild or severe case of osmosis blisters, appropriately known as the pocks. This is caused by water penetrating unstable resins in the gel coat. This hull had to be sandblasted by the yard to remove blisters as well as the underbody gel coat. Some dealers and buyers of new boats are having epoxy barrier coat rolled on to a prepared gel coat before the boat is launched. This gives the hull a protective cover to prevent water impregnation into the gel coat and fiberglass laminate. After this is done, 2 coats of anti-fouling paint are applied. Now you're ready to paint the underbody. As with all your jobs, you should have your supplies at hand. Wet and dry sandpaper or a pumice block, scraper, masking tape, anti-fouling paint, rollers and brushes, paint trays, rags, and cleaners. Examine the boot stripe. If it's in good condition, painting will be unnecessary. Simply polish it when you are polishing your hull to bring back the shine. If the gel coat is in poor condition, it will have to be painted. First, apply masking tape on the upper and lower edges of the boot stripe, pushing it hard onto the hull to prevent paint from creeping under the tape. Starting at the bow, sand the boot top with 180 grit sandpaper, making sure the surface is completely sanded. Dust off the sanded area with a clean rag, followed by a tack rag. Use a good 2-inch brush or a plastic sponge to apply the paint. It's advisable to use an anti-fouling boot top paint. To do a proper job, begin at the bow and work aft, brushing back into your work. This means the finishing stroke should be brushed back into the area which you have just painted. Pull off the masking tape as soon as you are finished to prevent it from sticking to the hull. If your boot top has a scribed end line, the paint can be cut in by brush. If you have a very steady hand, you need only to tape the bottom of the boot top. To prepare the hull underbody for a coat of anti-fouling paint, give it a good sanding with either wet sandpaper or a wet pumice block. After the hull is rinsed off and is completely dry, mask off the lower edge of the boot stripe with low-tack masking tape. Select an anti-fouling paint from the boat yard or chandler that is suitable for your local waters. You can use a non-toxic additive in the paint, which should extend the life of the paint and stop slime and grassy marine growth, as well as barnacles from adhering to it. The paint can be applied by roller or brush. Start by cutting in the waterline with a brush. Then finish off with a roller. It's a good idea to double coat from the boot top to about 2 feet down, as this area is subject to being worn off and vulnerable to the sun. Make sure you don't paint the lower surface of the depth finder transducer, the speed impeller, or the propeller shaft. The final job is to replace the zinc anodes. Launching the boat is the happy conclusion to all of your hard work. However, there are a few important things you should check before your boat leaves the yard. As soon as the boat is in the water, go aboard and check for leaks. Examine all the seacocks, through-hull fittings, packing glands, and hose connections for those pesky leaks. If there's a free-running leak, try to tighten it. If the leak doesn't stop, the boat may have to be pulled out until the problem is solved. If the propeller was found to be running true and there is an unexplained vibration in the propeller shaft, the engine could be misaligned with the shaft. The shaft-to-engine coupling should be checked by the yard personnel, as it requires a technician who is able to make the conical and parallel adjustments if the engine is out of line. As the main engine, or engines, are the heart of the boat, it's very important to start a program of preventive maintenance from the first day you own your boat. There are 4 essentials that keep an engine running properly: a good supply of clean fuel, air, lubricating oil, and water. If these ingredients are supplied, your engine will give you many years of faithful service. The maintenance of diesel and gasoline engines is the same. Both have electrical, fuel, lubricating, and cooling systems. The main difference? A gasoline engine has an electrical ignition system and a carburation fuel system, whereas a diesel engine ignites the fuel by compression, and the fuel is supplied by injectors. The engine is started by an electric starting motor. It should be reasonably trouble-free and require little attention, except to ensure the battery cables are sound and the terminal connections are tight and uncorroded. Most boats will usually have 2 sets of batteries, the starting batteries and the house batteries for running lights, bilge pumps, blowers, radios, and navigation electronics. When selecting storage batteries, make sure they are the correct amp hours to handle the loads required of them. If the vessel has large high-compression V8 diesels, it will naturally require heavy-duty batteries. Should the storage batteries ever fail to start the engine, the house batteries can be combined with them by using a vapor-proof connector switch, and the combined power should be able to start the engine. When the vessel is put away for the week, many owners plug in the shore power and turn on the battery charger without even checking to see if the batteries need charging. These batteries could probably have remained uncharged for months with very small loss of power. The main reason for battery failure is overcharging. Most batteries don't die, they are murdered. If the batteries are low, they should be charged with an automatic charger. The charger senses when the battery is fully charged and will shut off until some load, like an automatic bilge pump, puts a demand on it. The batteries should be inspected at least 3 times a year to ensure the electrolyte in the cells never gets below the plate level. If it does, refill the cells with distilled water, which has no minerals or impurities. Some deep cycle batteries are maintenance-free and don't need filling with water. The battery terminals should be free of corrosive buildup and kept covered with a liquid terminal protector or a non-water soluble grease. The batteries must be kept in non-metallic boxes, like fiberglass or wood, which are lined with lead or fiberglass. These boxes should have locked-down ventilated covers. The whole box must be absolutely secure from any motion at sea, including upward. A battery should be stored in a temperature which is suitable for humans. The water pump, alternator, and generator are belt-driven from the engine. Inspect these belts occasionally for cracks or excessive wear. They should be adjusted so there's no slippage on the pulley. Make sure the fuel tanks are full of clean fuel. This will help reduce condensation in the tank. It's a good idea to add a diesel fuel fungicide from time to time to prevent algae from growing in the tanks. It's a very good practice to filter the fuel before it enters your tank. You never know what impurities may be coming from the fuel supply. A simple method is to filter the fuel hose nozzle with a few layers of cheesecloth or a nylon stocking, or a filtering funnel. To prevent diesel fuel from staining the teak deck, Squirt a liberal amount of household detergent on the deck around the fuel filler cap. Then, after fueling, simply hose off the detergent. The following procedures are absolutely necessary when filling gasoline tanks. 1. Close all hatches and companion doors to prevent the invisible and explosive gasoline fumes from seeping into the boat. 2. Ask all crew or guests to leave the boat and insist on no smoking. 3. After fueling, open all hatches and engine compartments to thoroughly ventilate the inside of the boat. If there is no gas vapor detector in the engine compartment, use your nose to sniff for fumes. 4. When you are completely satisfied there are no fumes, turn on the engine compartment blower for 4 to 5 minutes before starting the engine. 4,000 preventable explosions occur yearly, usually after fueling. The fumes from 1 gallon of gasoline have the explosive power of 10 sticks of dynamite, and that's a mighty big bang. Many fuel filler caps are simply labeled fuel. It's mandatory the caps are labeled gas or diesel to prevent accidental fueling with the wrong fuel. It's also mandatory the water filler cap is labeled water. It will be difficult and expensive to flush out a water tank that's been topped off with diesel or gasoline, or a fuel tank topped off with water. These mistakes are made all of the time, usually with unfortunate results. Most diesel engines are fitted with 2 replaceable cartridge fuel filters. The primary filter is downstream of the fuel tank shutoff valve. The secondary filter is on the engine between the lift pump and the injector pump. Gasoline engines usually have only 1 filter on the engine. Once a year, or every 100 hours, you should replace the primary filter. The secondary ones every 2 years. To do so, remove the filter container. Then remove the element and clean out the container. If there's any sediment from the fuel, this is where it will accumulate. Install a new element and gasket and replace the container. For diesel engines only, it's necessary to bleed the air out of the fuel system before starting the engine. See the engine manual for the correct procedure for your engine. Water traps in the base of the fuel filter bowl should be drained regularly. Some prudent mariners install 2 separate primary and secondary filters with a 2-way valve. If one set of filters becomes clogged, the captain has time to switch over to the other set of filters before the engine stops from fuel starvation. Later, the clogged filters can be changed. Clean air is as important as clean fuel, so the air filter should be clean as well. If your air filter has a paper element, the element should be replaced at this time. If it's the plastic sponge type, clean or replace. The flexible fuel hose between the copper fuel line and the engine connection must be an approved fire retardant Type A fuel hose, as recommended by the Coast Guard. The diesel engine requires more air for maximum efficiency than a gasoline engine, especially if it's turbocharged. The air supply to the engine compartment must be adequate to supply the engine and to reduce the ambient temperature in the engine space. Some engine compartments will have auxiliary intake and exhaust blowers to assist air supply, particularly if there are 2 main engines and an auxiliary generator running at the same time. The gasoline engine's ignition system is the life-giving spark for the engine and must be in excellent condition. Carefully examine the distributor cap for hairline cracks. If any are evident, the cap must be replaced. Examine the ignition points and rotor for burned spots. Examine all of the wiring from the distributor and coil to the spark plugs, as well as the spark plugs for burn spots. The carburetor, which mixes the gasoline and air in the exact proportions to run the engine, must be fitted with a flame arrestor. This device prevents backfiring into the engine space, preventing an explosion. Occasionally, the flame arrestor should be removed and cleaned. This will ensure a flow of clean air to the carburetor. Clean with solvent. Never use gasoline. Make sure the engine extractor blower hose is drawing from under the gasoline engine bilge, and the fumes are blown out through a flexible hose to an aft deck cowl. Because gasoline fumes are heavier than air, it's a good idea to install a gas vapor detector with an alarm. With these precautions, the engine should be safe from explosion and fire. The lubricating oil and oil filter should be changed every 100 hours. Your hour meter will tell you when it's time. First, run your engine until the oil reaches the correct operating temperature. Never change oil when the oil is cold. Next, take a sample of the oil. This oil can be tested later to see if any water or fuel has gotten into the system. Oil analysis can determine many of the subtle problems that are developing in an engine, like salt buildup or excessive wear. Insert the suction hose into the dipstick tube and push it all the way to the bottom of the oil sump. Remove all of the oil. Some diesel engines have a separate hand pump on the engine to pump out the oil. If not, you can get a manual or electric pump from the chandler. As oil is often spilt when changing the oil filter, put a bucket under the filter to keep the bilge clean. Remove the bolt that secures the metal filter bowl and then remove the casing from the filter housing. Remove the old filter element. Place into a plastic bag for later disposal. Pour the oil into a suitable container and clean out the filter bowl. Then replace with a new element and gasket. Make sure the gasket is properly inserted into the groove of the filter body before you tighten the bowl into position. Reattach the filter bowl to the filter body. You really need a six-handed monkey to do this job properly. When you are finished, wipe off any excess oil. You can dispose of the used oil in a dumpster. Do not dump in the water. If the filter bowl is mounted in the inverted position, place a plastic bag over the whole assembly to catch the spilt oil. Replace the oil with the type recommended by the manufacturer, being careful not to spill any on the engine or on the engine room floor. Wipe up any that does accidentally spill to keep your engine clean. With the new oil and filter in place, start your engine and let it run for 15 minutes or more, and then check for leaks, particularly at the filter gasket. Always check the oil level on the dipstick every time the engine is used. If any oil leaks develop, attend to them immediately. Also, check the gearbox oil level with the dipstick. Your engine should be equipped with an alarm bell or buzzer to warn you if an oil leak has occurred. It should also have a temperature alarm to warn you if the engine is overheating. Either of these situations could allow an engine to seize up, causing a very expensive engine overhaul. It's a poor idea to rely on lights or gauges, as they are not always monitored. The raw water pump draws the water in from the hull seacock and pumps it into the engine cooling channels. This water must be filtered by an internal sea strainer to protect the system from foreign material fouling the pump and the cooling system. These sea strainers should be inspected and cleaned out regularly. The main part of the raw water pump is the rotating neoprene impeller, which must be checked to make sure there are no missing blades. If a blade breaks off, it could restrict or stop the flow of water to the engine and be forced into the water pump housing or the engine. If any of the blades are broken, they must be removed when you change the impeller. If the engine has a freshwater heat exchanger and an oil cooler, the pencil-type zinc anodes should be changed regularly to prevent galvanic corrosion attacking the inner core of the heat exchanger. This condition will perforate the core and allow the oil to be blown out with the exhaust cooling water. Should this happen, the oil supply will be reduced very quickly. The oil pressure alarm should give the warning in time to shut the engine down, thus preventing serious damage. The freshwater heat exchanger should be filled with water and an approved rust inhibitor or antifreeze, mixed in the ratio of 50-50. After use, the engine should be given a good wipe down to clean off dust or oil. This is called making love to your engine. Love it, and it will serve you faithfully. Neglect it, and it will let you down, usually at the worst time. The engine compartment should have an automatic Halon 1301 fire extinguisher installed. The extinguisher should be large enough to cover the entire engine room should a fire break out. These life-saving devices are inexpensive considering their importance, and will extinguish a fire before the people on board are aware there is one. Most marine insurance companies offer a discount if a Halon is installed. Every boat should have the engine repair and maintenance manual and a parts list on board. Naturally, a good tool kit should be on board with all of the tools necessary to make repairs and replacements. All of the safety gear on board should be of the best quality. Each boat should have one approved life preserver for each passenger, located in an easily accessible locker and known to all aboard. There should be 2 or more fire extinguishers of the type that will extinguish A, B, and C class fires. They should be mounted in conspicuous places and serviced every year and the inspection date tag attached. If the gauge indicates there is no pressure, have the extinguisher refilled. Everyone on board should know how to operate them. If you have a smoke alarm on board, it's even better. To signal for help, you should have an electric or freon horn and a fog bell, as well as a good supply of a variety of flares. These should be replaced before the expiration date. You should have approved safety harnesses. A throwable life preserver should be mounted close to the helmsman and secured to the stanchion. Offshore cruisers and racers are required to install a flagged man-overboard pole with a strobe light and whistle attached to the preserver. If you boat in an area subject to fog, you should have a radar reflector to alert other vessels of your presence. The compass should be adjusted for deviation and all magnetic metal kept away from it. If the boat has liquid petroleum gas, known as propane, or compressed natural gas, called CNG, on board for cooking, insurance companies require the gas tank be either stowed securely in a vented deck locker or an airtight sealed locker inside the hull. The CN gas locker must also be vented at the top to the air. Do not store the CN gas tank in a cockpit locker or down below. If you have LP or propane gas, the locker must be vented at the bottom. The opening to this locker should be built so escaping gas cannot leak into the boat. Propane gas, like gasoline fumes, are heavier than air and will flow into the bilge and are a potential for an explosion and fire. To test for gas leaks, first open the tank valve. Then apply soapy water to all connections in the gas system, including the hose connections at the stove. If there is a gas leak, soap bubbles will form. A leak, no matter how small, must be repaired immediately before the system is used. Don't forget to soap the solenoid valve and the pressure regulator. This solenoid valve is activated by a switch in the galley. A gas sensor detector and alarm should be installed under the stove in the bilge to alert you of gas leaking from the stove or gas lines. It should be tested frequently before you need it. Every year, all deck gear such as anchor windlass, anchors, anchor chains, shackles, nylon rod, lifelines, wedges, and stanchion mountings should be checked for defects. Make sure the anchor shackle pin is wired to the shackle. The winches should be disassembled, cleaned with solvent, and lubricated with special winch grease every year, or whenever they fail to turn easily by hand. When salt water gets inside, it starts a destructive corrosion process that must be stopped. Offshore cruisers and racers should have an EPIRB, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. This life-saving device emits a strong radio signal to military and commercial aircraft, as well as satellites, on 243 UHF frequency. These devices have a range of 200 to 300 miles. Finally, offshore racers and cruisers should have an inflatable life raft large enough to accommodate the crew. It should have adequate provisions and a safety pack and be retested every year. All boats should have a first aid kit. Before you take your boat out for a season of sailing or cruising, make sure your insurance premiums are paid and the policy covers the fair market value of your vessel, including any new gear installed or any increase in value. Ask your insurance broker if the company offers a premium discount when there's a Halon automatic fire extinguisher installed in the engine compartment. Also, most insurance companies require a new survey approximately every 4 years. If you have followed a good preventive maintenance program, your vessel will pass survey with flying colors. Plus, you've earned a pat on the back for keeping a boat in excellent condition. The well-found and properly equipped vessel, which is operated by a competent owner or captain, is the best example to all. There's no substitute for conscientious maintenance and first-class operating equipment. Always remember, the sea is terribly unforgiving of neglect and mistakes. Safety is no accident, so be careful out there, and above all, enjoy using your boat. Bon voyage.